When Aaron first brought up a prenup, we were 6 months into planning the wedding, and I laughed like he'd told a joke at his own expense. We were standing in the kitchen with a stack of invitation samples and a bowl of blueberries between us. He said it gently, almost careful, "Hey, can we talk about a prenup?" And I reacted like he'd called me untrustworthy. I remember putting down the swatch book and saying, "Why would we plan to fail?" He held my gaze and said something about clarity being kindness and wanting us both to feel secure no matter what. I rolled my eyes and said prenups were toxic, that they killed romance, that only people who expected to divorce needed them. He didn't push. He just nodded and said we could revisit it later. I considered that a win. Aaron is practical in a way that used to calm me. He's a civil engineer who has never once sent a text without punctuation. He pays bills early, reads the fine print, and knows which credit card gives the best points for groceries versus gas. I'm the opposite, marketing brain, creative, allergic to spreadsheets. The balance worked for us. He grounded me. I made him try new restaurants that didn't have a kids menu. When we got engaged, I felt confident we'd figured it out, my color-coded Pinterest boards and his calendar reminders. We knew how to talk through differences. Or so I thought. The truth is we'd already disagreed about money long before the prenup conversation. He didn't like that I carried a small balance on my credit card 4 points. I didn't like that he tracked expenses in a budgeting app and wanted to go over them together like a quarterly review. We compromised in small ways. I stopped calling everything a treat, he stopped suggesting we pack sandwiches to date night. But the cracks were there. I just kept covering them with flowers and RSVP cards. Then my grandmother died. It was sudden, though she'd been fragile for years. She was the one person who never made love feel conditional. She let me ruin a batch of pancakes every summer and said my burned ones tasted like campfire. Her apartment smelled like ivory soap and dryer sheets, and her laugh could fix a day. The funeral was small and sweet. Aaron held my hand through all of it. He helped my mother sort boxes and label keepsakes. He fixed a broken cabinet hinge in Grandma's kitchen without being asked. I thought, not for the first time, that I had chosen a good man. A month later, the lawyer read her will. I went alone because it felt like something I should do with my mother, and because money during grief feels like bad manners. I expected a little something. Maybe the beaded clutch Grandma saved for special dinners, maybe a small bond. When the lawyer said the number, my brain fuzzed out. $800,000. My grandmother had lived like a widow who clipped coupons and reused foil, but apparently she'd invested forever ago in a company that later exploded. She'd never told anyone. It felt impossible and unfair and like a miracle dropped into the wrong month of my life. I called Aaron from the sidewalk. I told him I was shaking. He asked where I was and said he'd pick me up. On the car ride home, I cried and laughed and cried again. He listened, squeezed my knee at stoplights, and didn't say anything about the money beyond, "I'm proud of your grandma. She was smart." When we got home, he made tea. We sat at the table where we'd argued about florals versus greenery 2 nights before, and the silence was heavy with a new kind of math neither of us knew how to do. He didn't bring up the prenup that night. I did 2 days later, in a tone that was basically a victory lap. I said, "Well, I guess now you really don't need one, since it's my money," trying to make it a joke. He didn't laugh. He said, "I think now is exactly when we should talk about one." I've replayed that moment in my head 100 times. The way his voice was steady and kind while my chest went hot like I'd been caught doing something wrong. I snapped that he was acting like I'd married him for his future income and now he wanted to protect himself from mine. He said the words transparency and stewardship and legacy, and I heard only "you don't trust me." The next week was a mess of half-fights and swallowed sentences. He sent me a draft from his lawyer, who turned out to be a polite woman named Melissa who wrote everything in plain English. It wasn't a "you get nothing if we divorce" trap. It said the inheritance and anything bought with it would remain separate property, that we'd disclose all assets and debts, and that if we divorced after a certain number of years there'd be a fair settlement based on a formula. There was even a clause about creating a joint rainy day fund. I skimmed, saw legalese, and shut down. I told him signing felt like admitting we wouldn't make it. He told me not signing felt like I wanted the option to take his savings and this new money, mix it together, and make it complicated on purpose. That stung, so I called him cold. I talked to my mother next. She surprised me. She said Grandma would have wanted me to protect the gift. She said marriage can be both love and contract and that those things don't cancel each other out. She reminded me of her own divorce from my father and how messy it got when no one could remember what was whose. I didn't want to hear it. I wanted her to say Aaron was being unromantic. She didn't. She asked me what I was afraid of. I changed the subject. We tried to meet in the middle. He suggested we sign after the wedding to make me feel less like it was a condition. I said, fine, we'll revisit in a year, hoping he'd let it die. He asked if we could at least keep the money in a separate account with my name only, not to control it but to make the legal lines clear. I balked again because it sounded like separation. The whole time, I kept telling myself I wasn't greedy. I wouldn't change. I'd use the money for a house with a backyard. I'd pay off my card. I'd put some away for hypothetical children. But under that, something smaller and meaner was whispering, this is mine, not ours. The first outright blow-up happened when we met with Melissa together. She walked us through the draft calmly. She asked me what didn't feel fair. I said something dramatic about how love isn't a spreadsheet. Aaron went quiet in the way that means he's frustrated and trying not to say the wrong thing. Melissa asked if I had my own attorney look it over, because she represented Aaron's interests. I said I didn't need one, I had common sense. She said kindly, an agreement you sign without advice isn't a fair agreement, and I heard it as a trap. I was defensive and rude. On the way home, I told Aaron I felt ambushed. He said, you refuse to read it. I'm trying to make you comfortable with clarity. I told him clarity was his word for control. He didn't sleep at my apartment that night. While we were busy hardening around the topic, the wedding machine kept grinding forward. Deposits due, vendor calls, seating charts. My friends threw me a shower, we took engagement photos in a park that looked like it had been invented for that purpose. In every picture, he looked solid and kind and a little tired. I look pretty in that way pros make you look, but when I stare long enough I can see the tension in my jaw. We were performing a future we hadn't agreed on. 2 weeks before final payment to the venue, Aaron asked me to sit down. He had a folder with him. Not the prenup, just our budget. He said we could pay cash now for everything and not carry any debt into marriage, or we could scale back and save more for the house. He said he didn't want to blow a windfall on a single day. I heard, you're cheap, you're ruining my fairy tale. I told him the wedding was mine, that I'd waited my whole life for it, and that money was meant to make life better, so why not start with joy? He said, I'm trying to protect our joy for later too. I told him if he wanted a courthouse, he should propose to a spreadsheet. He flinched like I'd slapped him. The next morning, he sent me an email. Not a text. Not a voice note. An email with the subject line where I am. He wrote that he loved me. That he wanted to marry me. That nothing about the prenup was a trap to take from me or a plan to leave. He wrote that he could not marry someone who equated boundaries with betrayal. That he was willing to pay for everything that was already non-refundable, but that he needed an answer on the prenup by the end of the week because clarity before we stood in front of people mattered to him. He said he would accept no as an answer, but that it would be the end of our engagement. I read it 3 times and felt like the room had tilted. I called my maid of honor, who told me to play chicken and he'd cave. I called my mother, who told me to call a lawyer. I called the lawyer Melissa had recommended, who walked me through the draft and suggested 2 tweaks in my favor. Things Aaron immediately accepted. I still dragged my feet. Some part of me was addicted to the idea that love should be enough and paper was an insult to the story I'd been writing in my head since I was 12. We met at the park where we took our photos. It was humid, my hair stuck to my neck. Aaron's voice was steady, but he kept rubbing his thumb against his palm the way he does when he's trying to keep his cool. He asked me to tell him plainly what I wanted. I said I wanted him without conditions. He said he wanted me in conditions that protected both of us. He said that if one of us got sick, or if we had kids and one of us paused a career, the document would make sure no one was punished for loving the family more than work. He said if we never divorced, it would sit in a drawer and grow old right next to us. He said the point wasn't to predict an ending, it was to remove fear from the middle. I started crying because somewhere inside me I knew he was right, and I also knew how stubborn I'd been. Then I did the thing I still hate admitting. I gave him a speech about trust and romance and how my grandmother didn't need a prenup to stay married 51 years. He closed his eyes like he was watching a door shut. He said, "I'm calling off the wedding." He handled it with a grace I didn't deserve. He called vendors, took responsibility, lost deposits. He told his parents. He let me tell mine. He didn't go online and ruin me. He didn't gossip to our friends. He gave me the ring back because it had been my grandmother's, and when I tried to hand him a check for his losses, he said, "Keep your money. You'll need it." I hated that sentence until I needed it. The first weeks after felt like I'd stepped off a curb I hadn't seen. I moved through the apartment that was supposed to be temporary, now suddenly permanent. The inheritance sat in an account with my name only, exactly the separation I'd fought against. I met with a financial planner. My mother's idea. And learned what taxes would do, what investments could be, how fast big numbers shrink when you're careless. I paid off my card. I sent my mother on a trip she never would have taken alone. I cried in the cereal aisle because the brand we liked was on sale and buying it felt like theft from the life I'd lost. I still see him sometimes. Not in person. Our city is big enough. But in places he touched. A shelf he helped hang that is still strangely level. The dentist toolbox made in my hall closet. The email I reread on bad nights that starts with "where I am" and ends with "I wish you could meet me here." I used to tell myself he wanted to control me. Now I think he wanted to protect us from the ugly version of ourselves money can make. He was asking for a promise I could have kept if I'd been brave enough to say that love and paper aren't enemies. People ask what happened and I have a short answer I use for casual friends: we wanted different things. The true answer is longer and more embarrassing. I mocked something I didn't understand because it threatened the story I preferred. I equated boundaries with betrayal. I confused a legal document with a lack of love. And when grief and luck collided and handed me more than I'd ever had, I chose to clutch it instead of build with it. He didn't punish me. He simply refused to step into a marriage where everything had to be mine to feel like ours. I still have the money. I don't have the man. And on quiet nights, I can admit which one would have made me feel safer.